Hi everybody, welcome to A Course in Miracles Applied. Today's topic is called our disidentification from fear. This segment serves as a conclusion of or to the 3-book series called The Healing of Fear, A Journey Through A Course in Miracles. I want to give you a little background on that before we start. So about 4 years ago, I had the idea of writing down my kind of an account of my journey with the Course. I had kept some notebooks over the years and thought it might be a good idea to consolidate everything and put it all in one document. The process took about a year, and it spans a time from my mid-20s all the way to the present. The book is called My Life Without, in brackets, Jesus, a memoir. Once the book was done, I had another idea, which was now I should write down everything I knew about the Course. I had no idea what this really entailed, and I started this channel parallel to writing the first volume of that book, which is called The Healing of Fear, A Journey Through A Course in Miracles. Now, the process of writing it and thinking about it and fleshing out the concepts of the Course not only deepened my understanding of it, but some of the later chapters of the later volumes are direct results of me deep diving into those topics and applying them to my own life. And the final product is the 3 volumes. The third one is still in the works, and this segment that we're doing right now is the conclusion of the third book, which is the conclusion of the series. So looking back at those last 4 years and my whole life basically with the Course, really the whole learning happened around the theme of fear in one way or another. When I wrote My Life Without Jesus, my fear increased to a level where my blood pressure was elevated, my chest was tight, my heart rate was up, and I thought at many occasions that I would die. I literally thought I would die. And Jesus talks about this in chapter 3 of the text. He says, chapter 3, section 7, he says, as you approach the beginning, you feel the fear of the destruction of your thought system upon you as if it were the fear of death. There is no death, but there is a belief in death. I visited a few heart specialists. I got ultrasounds and checkups and EKGs and all that nice stuff. Always with the same results. Physically, I was perfectly fine. One doctor prescribed some mild blood pressure medication, and I got some mild anti-palpitation medication for anxiety. Now, through writing the chapters and applying those weekly topics to my own life, throughout all this journey of fear, one item stood out for me as a summary of sorts, perfectly represented in the following quote from chapter 10 in the text. And the quote is this. It says, it's chapter 10, introduction, paragraph 1. Nothing beyond yourself can make you fearful or loving, because nothing is beyond you. So looking back over the last 4 years, and basically over the last 30 years, pretty much in one way closed a chapter for me and another one opened, but it feels as if this segment now is the closure of this very long process. Another one is opening, but that's what I can say, that the last 30 years, this is kind of, it feels like this is a closure of something. And I realized that it had been my lesson all along, entailing the lessons around fear, entailing two very specific applications of course principles. And those two applications revolve around what Ken Wapnick called the unholy trinity of sin, guilt, and fear. And we will use this model as the foundation for this chapter and add a fourth part, which is attack. And that's basically the model that we're using. This is all in the wrong mind, right? There's no Holy Spirit in here. This is all the sequence of events in the wrong mind. And to start, let's go back to the tiny mad idea, because that's the beginning of it all, right? So when the tiny mad idea seemingly occurred in the mind of the Son of God, or in the mind of the minuscule part of the Son of God, that part chose to take this tiny mad idea seriously. There were two reactions to this tiny mad idea. One was that of the Holy Spirit, right? Which always says, which tiny mad idea, right? Because oneness cannot be divided. The idea was not of any concern because it was just an idea and not reality, right? That's the end of that. But when the Son of God took the idea of this tiny mad idea of separation seriously, the ego was born. And from there, the ego's goal was to stay alive, right? Makes total sense. And to do that, to stay alive, the ego's goal was for the Son to leave the mind, because the mind is the place in which the Son of God can decide against the ego. That's the only place the Son of God can decide against the ego, is the mind. So the ego came up with a story, and that story involved sin. The sin of separating and thereby destroying the oneness of heaven. A tremendous experience of guilt followed, and this guilt was so acute, as the Course says, that it had to be projected outward through attack onto God. Now the Son of God does no longer have the murderous thought of having killed God. Through projection, this thought now is with God. And that is where the Son of God the first time experiences fear. He's not afraid, the Son of God is not afraid of God. The Son of God is afraid of the projection of his own murderous thoughts onto God, right? It's very important. And because of that projection of those sinful and guilty thoughts onto God, unconditional love became a vengeful God. And we're going to go back to that principle in a little bit. And the Course says in the Manual for Teachers, section 17, paragraph 7, it says, "And now there is no hope except to kill. Here is salvation now. An angry father pursues his guilty son, kill or be killed, for here alone is choice." So we are in the mind, and in the mind exists us with this tremendous experience of guilt and the sense of sin that is so acute that we have to project it outward onto God. And now God has this whole package, and we are now afraid of God, who is in the mind, and we are in the mind. And then we ask the ego, what shall we do? And the ego tells us, according to its plan of getting us away from the mind, as far away as possible from the mind, the ego tells us to flee into the world, to make a world and go into the world. So the Son of God fled from the mind into a world that now promises to keep the guilt away from it, from the Son of God. At that point, the ego's goal has been reached, because the Son is now fully identified with the world, with the body, and with the thought system of sin, guilt, attack, and fear. The ego's goal is for the Son of God to be as far away from the mind as possible, and the ego's goal seems to have been reached. So the Son of God went from up here, the state of heaven. He took the tiny mad idea seriously, believed in sin, an overwhelming experience of guilt. This says attack through projection, attacking God through projecting the Son's guilt onto God, then fled from the mind. Fear is born. In the world we are now, perceiving guilt in others and afraid of what's going on in the world. That is the outcome, right? This is the end of the journey. This is where we are right now, right? And the whole process is the process of identification with the world. So the Son of God, us, we are constantly trying to keep guilt away from us, while trying to keep fear at bay. And fear being the natural outcome of the attack on God, and the attack on God being the means of pushing away the guilt that we experience based on our sin of killing God, that the ego tells the Son that he has killed God. So we killed God, this is the sin, we experience guilt, we project it onto God, we attack God, now we're afraid of God, we flee into the world, and that fear is now displaced into the world. We're afraid of the world, and we see guilt outside. It's important to note that in our practice, because we are practicing so much with fear in the course, that there cannot be fear without attack. Right? Guilt projected outward is the attack, and fear is the logical effect of us projecting out the guilt to the outside. There cannot be attack without the belief in sin and guilt, and there cannot be fear without the attack. And the Course says, thus does he fear his own attack, but sees it at another's hand. That is in the text, chapter 28, section 2. So the ego's goal, again, is to keep us in this fearful state down here, right? Far removed from the mind. That is the ego's goal, to keep us away from the mind. But it's important to the ego's survival that we don't know that we're fearful, right? We don't know that we're fearful. We are preoccupied with trying to push guilt outside of us, to see other people as the guilty ones. And we're distracted from the real issue by our identification with the world and with the body, with all kinds of problems in the world we identify with, right? We believe that this mechanism of identifying with the world will keep us safe from God who is in the mind. So the more afraid we are of God in the mind, the deeper our identification with the world becomes. But we're all in the same boat, because we're all here because we fled the mind. Each and every one of us, right, is in this very same boat. Now, the ego's goal for us, as I said, is to be down here in complete ego identification, Because only through our complete identification with the ego, in what Star Trek people call the mind melt, right? If you remember, only through that identification with the ego is the ego's survival ensured. It lives through and only by our decision for it. It has no life on its own. And it makes sure we consistently and constantly choose it by telling us that the only way our fear will lessen is complete identification with the world in a mindless state far away from the mind. Now, Jesus' goal for us with the Course must be the opposite, right? It is complete disidentification from the ego. That is Jesus' goal with this Course. Our current identification with the ego is 100%. Right? We think it's less, it might be less, but for the sake of this being a learning situation, I think it's good to assume we are in our ego, with our ego 100%. We are fully identified with the ego. How can we then, because we believe we are the ego, how can we disidentify with the ego? And more importantly, how can we disidentify from the ego without being afraid that we're losing our own self? Because we have mind melted, the Son of God has mind melted with the ego. We are completely joined at the hip with the ego, right? If you would have a piece of Velcro that is 2 feet by 2 feet and you attach it together, it is extremely hard to rip it apart, right? So this is a very bad example of our identification with the ego. We are melted into each other. The Son of God and the ego are 100% aligned. We are completely identified with the ego. Our goals are aligned, right? Our goal, because we're afraid of God in the mind, our goal is to be identified in the world, to be safe, quote unquote. The ego's goal is for us to be as far away from this piece, from this part of our mind where we can make a decision against the ego, and it sends us into the world to identify with the world. So the ego's goal and our goal are the same. We are 100% melted into the ego's thought system. We have become the ego. So Jesus gives us a way of disidentifying with the ego in the Course. And in very rough terms, we can learn how to disidentify from the ego in 2 ways. The application for both is the very same, but we can practice with 2 different pathways, right? The one is the attack. We practice with the attack on others, the perception of guilt, and the other path is we practice on our fear. Those are the 2 parallel pathways with the Course, roughly. Working on either of one of those paths will positively influence the other path, right? They kind of flow in and out of each other. They are not completely separate. And they can't be separate because where there is guilt, there is fear. Where there is fear, there must have been guilt. So those 2 paths are in one way the same, but we can choose two different ways of working on them. And they both make a lot of sense. So we have discussed forgiveness before on this channel. And we'll discuss it again now and place it into the framework of this sequence here when we practice with our perception of guilt in others. If we can substitute forgiveness with looking without judgment, we are on the right track. Forgiveness is looking without judgment. To forgive is to look. Right? If we're on a deserted island, we forgot everything, and we just remember to forgive is to look. That gets us close to heaven's gate, right? To forgive is not to try to change our behavior or try to change how we think about a person. To forgive in the Course is not to love, right? Love is always there, it flows. There's a block in it, and forgiveness looks at the block and sees it for what it is. That's it, right? We look without judgment. And to forgive does not mean we stop attacking necessarily. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we're in the middle of an argument. We cannot stop this argument. This might just be in our head, but we can't stop it, but we can look at it. Right? We can always look at it. If we try to change what we think about a person, we are back in this dynamic of sin, guilt, attack, and fear. The ego loves when we try to change our thinking about a person. Jesus suggests it, but that's for the beginning of the journey and for the end of the journey. The middle part that we did in the last segment, Act 2, no freaking way, that's the time when we look at our judgment. We don't try to change it, right? We look at our judgment without judgment. We look at our attack without judgment. So in essence, we first see our sin in our brother, and we learn how to look at our sin and guilt and ask Jesus for help. So the ego tells us that we're sinful and guilty, right? So we deny this belief, afraid to get in touch with it ever again. We're afraid to get in touch with our guilt, right? Because the guilt brands us as being the one that has killed God. And we believe in attacking someone else, we can get rid of it successfully, right? So looking at the guilt in another person and seeing that we have simply projected our own sin onto the other, that is the correction. When we look at the guilt, we have given the other, when we look at the guilt we have given to the other person with Jesus, over time we realize that guilt is a made-up concept. But we cannot get to that until we look at it. So looking is forgiving. Looking is the most important aspect of the corrective process with the Course in Miracles. Jesus says in chapter 11 in the text, section 5, he says, "No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected." Right? The ego does not want us to look at our guilt out here and realize it's our own, because if we realize the guilt is our own, we're back in the mind. And we're getting dangerously close to that decision-making point where we can decide against the ego. So the ego will always tell us, look for guilt in the world and keep it there. Don't look at, the ego will never tell us to look at itself, right? And the ego will tell us, hey, you want to forgive? Okay, I'll give you forgiveness. Forgive what somebody else did. So we're forgiving something down here. We're still in the sin, guilt, attack, and fear mode, right? But the ego tells us, if you want to learn how to forgive, just forgive a person what this person did to you. We're still the victim of somebody else, right? This guilt is still outside. The Course calls this forgiveness to destroy in the pamphlet, the Song of Prayer. The ego wants us to see guilt clearly in another and then forgive it, right? And it wants us to change our mind on our own without Jesus and the Holy Spirit. It tells us you don't need them, right? You need them to pray for your enemies. You can do that, which keeps them enemies, right? But you don't need them to forgive. You don't need them to look. So this path of looking at our guilt that we have deposited to the outside will in time eliminate fear. Because fear, as we said, can only happen when we have first attacked. And if we look at the guilt that we have given to the other person with Jesus without judgment, there is no attack any longer. And there cannot be any fear any longer. One really important aspect of all this is that we cannot escape the ego from within the ego. Right? Ken talked about that all the time. And Jesus says we cannot escape an insane thought system from within. We have to go outside of this thought system and look back at it with sanity by our side. Right? That's how we escape the ego thought system. And this stepping outside of the ego thought system, that is what in time helps us to disidentify with the ego. Right? Each time I step outside of the ego and look at the ego without judgment, whatever that aspect of the ego is, it's so multifaceted, but it's all the same, right? But whenever I step outside and look at it from the outside with Jesus next to me without judgment, I peel a little bit off the Velcro of the ego, right? And then I go back in, I do my thing, I get upset, I judge, whatever it is, right? And then I go back out and look at it again with Jesus. And over time, each time I step outside, I see in my own mind, I see this bridge, and each time I step outside the ego, I put one brick down on the bridge to the real world. And eventually, I've looked at the whole ego thought system and I can decide against it for good, right? And then I'm on the other side. So if we step outside the ego, we must be something other than the ego. And that is the whole disidentification process that tells us you're no longer 100% insane. That's what Jesus says, right? You're no longer 100% your ego. You have stepped outside it a little bit, and now we're going further. We're going to go a little more every day. We step outside the ego and look at it, right? Look at the guilt with Jesus. That is what stepping outside the ego is. The second path, which is this one, goes through the fear. There's a quote that says, that we said in the beginning, it says, nothing beyond yourself can make you fearful or loving because nothing is beyond you. So this quote basically summarizes everything we have discussed so far. Nothing is beyond you means literally everything we see is an attack, a projection of our own belief in sin and guilt. We only see our own attack thoughts projected onto the world, as the workbook, the first couple of lessons say, right? It is a pictorial representation. The world is a pictorial representation of our attack thoughts. And fear arises because we believe our sinful thoughts that we have tried to push away onto others will come back to us. The attack that we made in pushing the guilt out will be bouncing right back, and the guilt will come straight back at us. That's our fear. And it describes this in chapter 7, section 8. It says, that is why those who project are vigilant for their own safety. We all do it, right? They are afraid that their projections will return and hurt them. Believing they have blotted their projections from their own minds, they also believe their projections are trying to creep back in. That means that is why Jesus uses projection, right? Because projection means even though we see the guilt outside, it stays inside. That is the whole principle of projection, is whatever is on the screen is definitely still inside the projector, which is in the mind. The ego just tells us whatever you project out, the attack that you do actually gets rid of the guilt, right? But it doesn't work, as we know. The next day, we see this person again, and it's back. The guilt is back. It's a consistent thing in our mind, a presence in our mind, is that guilt, that belief in guilt. So fear of the world, when we are afraid of things in the world, it can only be because we have attacked the world first and then we forgot about it. There's really no exception in this, and because there is no exception, we can ultimately be healed from that belief that caused it. And the belief that caused it is our belief in sin and the subsequent guilt. That is what causes the fear. Sin and guilt, the attack, projection into the world, and that's when fear comes in, right? So, for example, if we lay in bed at night, we all know this, right? We lay in bed at night, we're afraid that things could happen to our marriage or our job, our money, our health. We're not really afraid of any of those things. The ego's goal, again, is to keep our attention in the world. It tells us that we are afraid of things in the world. If we are constantly afraid of things in the world, we don't go back to the mind and potentially decide against the ego. So the ego's goal is for us to look into the world and see our fear there, see the cause for fear in the world, right? That's the ego's goal. Makes sense, because the ego wants us to be away from the mind. So what better way to do that than to tell us, oh, you're afraid of a virus, right? You're afraid of a war, or if your loved one dying. We're not afraid of anything in the world because, quote, the world can give you only what you gave it. For being nothing but your own projection, it has no meaning apart from what you found in it and placed your faith in. That is in the chapter 13, section 9. The world can give you only what you gave it. If we're afraid of the world, we gave that fear to the world, right? that means the world is actually neutral. In essence, the world is neutral. Everything we see in it, everything we're afraid of, is not in the world. Because of projection, everything we see in the world is in our own mind. Everything we're afraid of in the world is not, that fear is not of the world. It only appears that way because of our full identification with the world, and because our attack on the world is hidden from us, and our belief in separation is hidden from us. We don't see separation within ourselves. We see it in the world. We see sin in the world. We see guilt in the world. And we're afraid of fear in the world. Right? The whole contents of our mind have been placed onto the world. And Jesus' job in the Course is to reverse that. Right? Make us realize nothing is beyond you. Right? As he said, nothing beyond yourself can make you fearful or loving, because nothing is beyond you. It's all in your mind, projected outward. So because the ego's main focus, right, is on us being fully identified with the world in our body. That's the main focus of the ego. Meaning how we think and feel is a direct effect of the world and our body. The solution is to slowly but surely dislodge this identification. And the way to do is to apply the thought that we are not afraid of anything in the world onto whatever we are afraid of in the world. We might not see any gain from this for a while. Might take a while. Because our fear is so deeply rooted in this world, right? Our fear is very deeply rooted in the world. We actually believe we are afraid of things in the world. And everyone is. Course student or not, we're all afraid of things in the world. If somebody says, I'm not afraid of things in the world, he or she is either lying or so far advanced that they don't need the Course anymore. But for the rest of us, we are 100% afraid of the world. And we practice it. We start practicing it really when we acknowledge how much our state of mind depends on what happens in the world. That is the first step. We can't get anywhere without acknowledging what is right now, right? If we start with already a spiritual thought that says, "Oh no, I'm just projecting and it's just a defense against love," we're missing the first couple of rungs. And if we're missing the first couple of rungs, we're gonna have trouble reaching, right? So we go, the first step on this return journey with Jesus is we acknowledge what we think and what we feel. I'm afraid of a virus, I'm afraid of a war, I cannot seem to forgive this person, I hate this person, I hate Jesus, I'm afraid of Jesus, I'm afraid of the Course, I'm afraid of my neighbor, I'm afraid of spiders, I'm afraid of ticks, I'm afraid of my body breaking down, I'm afraid of death. Whatever we actually, in this world right here, feel and think, that's our starting point. And that is very important, to acknowledge first what it is we think we feel, right? So I'm afraid of catching a virus, I'm afraid of getting fired, I'm afraid of running out of money, whatever it is. Acknowledge the fear as we see it. That's the step one, right? Step 2 is to invite Jesus and the Holy Spirit to it. In step 2, we listen to Jesus, who tells us nothing beyond yourself can make you fearful. We then take this quote and apply it to our fear of the virus, our fear of the war. We can think something like, this virus is not what makes me fearful. If we can do that with everything we're afraid of in the world, we are making huge leaps toward our independence from the ego. That is the dislodging, the disidentifying from the ego. Again, the goal is not that we're not afraid of the world. The goal is for us to realize we are not afraid of the world, and apply this thought to each time we're afraid of something in the world, to realize we are not afraid of this thing. This exercise is very practical, right? It's not highfalutin up there somewhere in this atmosphere. It's a very practical application to realize that what I'm thinking I'm afraid of, I'm not really afraid of that. We still don't believe it for a while, right? But we can apply it. I'm not afraid of a war. I believe I'm afraid of a virus, but I'm not actually afraid of that virus. The fear is in the mind. It is not in the world. If you're a visual person, you can maybe practice with something like, if you're afraid of an item, let's say you're afraid of a spider, right? We're afraid of spiders. And we can tag that spider. Don't touch it, right? Don't be crazy, don't touch it. But we can tag this spider with our thoughts. And there is a string going back to our mind. So our mind, a string goes to a tag on that spider, and it says fear. And in this process, the first step is to say, okay, I'm tagging this spider because I'm afraid of the spider, right? The second step is to take back the spider without touching it again. Don't touch it. We take back the tag of that fear and we bring it back to our mind. And we realize the fear is not of the spider. The fear is from something, for something within. I want to discuss one more thing as a conclusion to this topic. We have discussed it a couple of times before, but I think I would be amiss if I wouldn't mention it again. What we're doing in this process, all of us together, right, is looking at our guilt, looking at our fear, and what that means is we're taking it all back. Right? We have wildly projected our guilt onto the world. We have wildly tagged objects and circumstances with our fear in the world, and now we're taking it all back. We go to Jesus and we say, I'll take it back. I take it back. Right? We know that's the way out. We take it back. Looking at our attack means we bring the guilt back from the world to us. So we can look at it with Jesus. We can't look at it out there. If the guilt is still with the other person, we can't see it with Jesus. We have to bring it back in. It is my guilt. Jesus, help me look at that. It's my guilt that I'm looking at. My sin that I gave to the other person. So looking at our fear and untagging the item, right? Bringing this fear back to us from the world brings the fear closer. Looking at guilt brings the guilt closer to us. Now we have attacked others for a reason, right? We think we need to, come hell and high water, get rid of guilt because we think God is going to kill us, right? We have to get the fear into the world because we are so afraid of what's going on in our mind that we must give the world the fear so we feel safe. We can get an alarm system if we're afraid of a burglar. If we're afraid of God in our mind, there's nothing we can do. That is very, very, very scary. This is why it's such a long and hard process, right? That's why we must practice with the utmost kindness for ourselves. This is a courageous thing we're doing. Forgiveness is the most courageous thing you can do. Because you're literally taking back the guilt that you pushed out because you think your life depended on it. Now you're taking it back. We're bringing the fear that we placed into the world to feel safe back into our mind. Imagine the fear in our mind. There is no escape. That is a very hard process. And everything that we do in both pathways, right? Looking at our guilt, bringing the guilt back in, looking at it with Jesus. Bringing the fear back in, looking at it with Jesus. Both of those paths prepare us for the final. If you're in computer games, it's the boss, right? The final boss. The dragon. Killing the dragon. The fear and the guilt combine within us, in the mind, just before that place where we can make a decision. That is where the fear of God is, right? In the obstacles to peace, that's the fourth obstacle. The fear of God is what we look at when we bring the guilt back, we bring the fear back, and we venture into the cave to look at the fear of God, right? I think this is the highest form of spirituality, is to look at guilt and look at our fear, bringing it back to us. Nothing less than sheer courage is asked of us, right? We are Frodo on our way to Mount Doom. Or if you know German literature, we are Siegfried in the Nibelungen saga, right? Who sets out to kill the dragon. We are everyone because we are doing this for everyone. Each time we look at fear and bring it back to the world, we contribute to the healing of the sonship. That doesn't mean we'll feel better, right? Each time we look at the guilt and look at the fear with Jesus, we contribute to the healing of the sonship. Nothing else contributes to the healing of the sonship than to look at our own obstacles to love. We don't feel the benefits of this work for a while. We might not feel it for a long time. The hero setting out to kill the dragon that scorched the village does not feel triumphant until the very end. The journey is treacherous, but because the hero has chosen mighty companions on the journey, like Sam for Frodo, right? Aragorn. The end is certain. The path there, though, might get very rocky at times. Disidentification from the ego is the highest form of spiritual practice. However we do it, right? Disidentification from the ego. The ego can only live through identification, through our identification with it. And the ego must be utterly afraid of us abandoning it, right? That's why this feels so long and filled with despair at times. It is not us really who is afraid. We are not the ones who are afraid. We are the Son of God, and we can't be afraid, right? In our nature, in our natural state, we cannot be afraid. But because we identified with the ego 100%, we feel the ego's fear as our own. We feel the ego's fear as our own. Each time we're afraid of something in the world, not only are we not afraid of the world, it is not us that is afraid, but the ego is afraid. The ego is afraid of us abandoning it and choosing for the Holy Spirit. The ego is afraid of the power of our mind. And once we begin to actually really and truly practice this course, quote, this is when it will shift abruptly from suspiciousness to viciousness, since its uncertainty is increased. That is in the text, chapter 9, section 7. So until we dislodge completely from the ego, our fear and our sense of guilt and sin will likely increase for a while. We take it all back, it increases. Jesus says, quote, you have not yet gone back far enough, and that is why you become so fearful. He says it in chapter 3, by the way. Chapter 3, section 7, he says, you will be afraid. And you have not gone yet far back enough, and that is why you become so fearful. So approaching the dragon's lair, right, as the hero of this quest, will increase the fear because we have not gone back far enough to the dragon. We have not actually looked at the dragon, which is the fear of God, and have looked at it with mercy rather than with terror. And that's why we're still afraid. The child that is afraid of a monster in the closet will be afraid all the way from the bed to the closet. And the fear will increase exponentially the closer it gets to the closet, until it opens the door and sees that there's nothing there at all. Until then, the fear will likely increase the closer it gets. The same happens in our own process, right? Our fear of God is based on a lie. But we don't believe it is a lie, right? There's no separation because, quote, oneness cannot be divided, as the Course says. Because there's no separation, there's no sin, subsequent guilt, and ultimately fear. All of it is a lie. But we don't believe it is a lie. Because we are fully identified with the ego, we believe the ego's lie 100%. And the only way to counteract this is to establish a relationship with Jesus or the Holy Spirit in the process. And Jesus' suggestion that we cannot do this alone is not just nice spiritual pep talk, right? He says in the Manual for Teachers, section 29, he says, to follow the Holy Spirit's guidance is to let yourself be absolved of guilt. It is the essence of the atonement. To follow the Holy Spirit's guidance is the essence of the atonement. It is the core of the curriculum. So because we are fully identified with the ego, we need a presence within our mind that is not inside the ego thought system. We need a presence within our mind that is outside the ego thought system, with which we can then look at the ego thought system from without the ego thought system. The most logical way to overcome the separation, which is the cause for sin, guilt, attack, fear, and complete identification with the world and the ego, is to join with a presence that is still connected to the oneness of heaven within us. The names the Course gives to that presence is Jesus and the Holy Spirit. So whether we're working on looking at our guilt here or dislodging from our fear, we need in both cases a relationship with Jesus or the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, we're simply continuing within the ego thought system and will go nowhere. This course requires an inner teacher. An external teacher can only go so far, and in the best case scenario can drop us off at the doorstep to our internal teacher. That's what Ken did all of his life, right? He was an external teacher leading us to our internal teacher, Jesus. That was his function. The external teacher falls away, the internal teacher takes over, right? And when he died, I think we all believed, oh my God, what do we do now? We have to take Jesus' hand at some point. We have to take the Holy Spirit's hand at some point, right? An external teacher can only get us so far. And our main work with this internal teacher begins when we begin to enter the cave that leads us to the dragon, to look at the fear of God. And to look at the fear of God will be with our inner teacher, that presence within our mind. Without that presence in our mind, we cannot look at the fear of God. It is absolutely too terrifying to even approach it. And the Course says that many times in the Obstacles to Peace and in other areas. So as a conclusion to this, I want to read the epilogue to the clarification of terms, which is the very last epilogue in the Course. I'm going to read paragraph 1. The whole epilogue is very, very beautiful, and it summarizes everything we've done the last 2 years on this channel and in those books. And in the Course and our work with the Course, it really summarizes everything. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph. It says, "Forget not, once this journey is begun, the end is certain. Doubt along the way will come and go to come again. Yet is the ending sure. No one can fail to do what God appointed him to do. When you forget, remember that you walk with him and with his word upon your heart. Who could despair when hope like this is his? Illusions of despair may seem to come, but learn how not to be deceived by them. Behind each one, there's reality and there's God. Why would you wait for this and trade it for illusions when his love is but an instant further on the road where all illusions end? The end is sure and guaranteed by God. Who stands before a lifeless image when a step away, the Holy of the Holies opens up an ancient door that leads beyond the world. Thank you for watching.